Sejam bem-vindos à Harvard TV Brasil. Eu sou Márcio Mussarella e aqui ao meu lado nós estamos recebendo Tony Mayo, que é Senior Lecturer da Business Administration e Director da Leadership Initiative, Harvard Business School. Welcome.
Thank you.
Tony, you're the author of the book In Their Time, when you made a research from different times in history and with different kinds of CEOs. Which came first, the idea for the book or the research?
The original idea for the book, it was actually different from where we ended up with.
Okay.
So the original idea for the book was really that we would create this canon of business leadership. So back when we started the research, we were thinking about Harvard's 100th anniversary. So Harvard was going to turn 100 years old, Harvard Business School in 2008, and wouldn't it be nice to create this canon of business leadership? So we should come up with who are the 20 or 30 leaders that all students should study. And so one of the things we thought about is if you sort of think about students that study literature, they read the great writers, and students that study art, they study the great painters. And so we said, who would that equivalent list be for businesses, for business leaders? Instead of just studying marketing or organizational behavior or finance, who would actually be on this canon of business leaders? And so that's where we started the project. We said, okay, let's figure out who could this 10 or 20 be. And then to be able to get to the 10 and 20, you have to do some research and say, okay, who would you put in there? And our research kept growing and growing, and over 3 years, we ended up with a data set of 1,000 business leaders. And we said, oh, okay, we could look at just 10 or 20, or we could look at the whole 1,000. And so we said, let's look at the whole 1,000. Let's look at them in the context of their time, and then get a sense of what did it take to be great in a particular period of time. That's why we called it In Their Time. And so we decided that we wouldn't come up with this canon after all, and we evolved into this other approach, which was really looking at a much broader set of leaders and what we can learn from those leaders.
When you say we look through these leaders, what were the sources? Biographies, testimonials? Where do you get the data?
So we looked at a number of different factors. So if you look at the 1,000 that's on our database, about a third of it came from financial analysis.
Okay.
Strictly looking at, performance at a particular period of time. And we looked at 3 different criteria. We looked at return on assets for the early years because there was no other criteria in 1890s and 1900s. So when we were looking at leaders from basically the 1880s up until the 1990s. We looked at return on assets, we also looked at market capitalization appreciations rate, and we looked at other variables, one called Tobin's Q. And based on how those businesses perform, we actually didn't look at the CEO, we just looked at what were the top ranking companies.
Okay.
And then we went back and we said, okay, who was the CEO when the company was performing great? And that was a very labor intensive process because there's no prior to the 1970s, there's no database in the United States that matches CEO tenure to a particular company. So we went through archival work with gloves and going through dusty books to try to figure out who was the CEO. And then from there, we tried to paint a portrait of that person's life. So that was about a third of it. The other 2/3 of it were based on historical lists. So Forbes came out with a list in the 40s. They came out with another list in the 80s. We looked at Fortune's list. We looked at a bunch of the top 100 lists and tried to get a sense of who was being named by their contemporaries. And then we did analysis on who sort of broke through the mold. So if you actually think about which are smaller businesses, so we didn't look at just publicly traded companies, we weren't just interested in that. We were interested in who changed the landscape for business. And so if we didn't look at that list, the predominance of the people on our list would be the traditional names, but we wanted to think about who were some of the minorities that actually broke through the list. How did women create opportunities for business? If I just focused on the top 1,000 companies, many of them, particularly in the historical context of the United States, would not have been running companies if there was a woman or a minority. And so we looked at people that actually broke the mold. Okay. So the first female millionaire. We looked at individuals in different industries that broke the mold, whether it's in the music industry or newspapers or other areas that weren't necessarily huge enterprises at the time. And so it's both a combination of quantitative and qualitative analysis. And so it's a huge undertaking to figure out who should be in this 1,000. The one thing that we thought about doing, which we kept going back and forth in, is do we include, like, who do we exclude?
Okay.
And so do we sort of exclude the sin industries? So somebody who is, alcohol or tobacco or pornography, do we get rid of those? Are they not considered great? And so my colleague and I kept going back and forth about whether we should include those individuals or not. We decided we'd have a wide net. We would include them if they were a legitimate business. The only people that were disqualified were people who were convicted of some illegal activity.
Okay.
So somebody like Martha Stewart, who we would, who would normally be on this list, is not because of her conviction. But if they were tried and acquitted, which is a little tricky, do we include them or not? And we had debates on that.
There's this fine line between one another.
Are they guilty or not? So, but we decided to keep the net wide. So that was the list of 1,000.
Okay, and from this research and all this, let's say, business archaeology, there's some findings came out, and one of them, I think the major one, it's the contextual intelligence.
Yes.
What is contextual intelligence, and what you can say about it?
So for contextual intelligence, what we meant there is we decided to take these 1,000 and then place them in the context in which they operated. So what was the decade in which they founded their company or became the CEO? And then we looked at 6 variables. We looked at how government intervention, we looked at technology, we looked at labor, demographic shifts, global events, and social mores.
But you named those 6 factors before to guide the research, or they appeared along the research?
That's a very good
Which
question.
came first?
What came first, the 6 factors or?
You started to see a repetition.
I think we actually came up with the 6 factors first, because we said we were trying to understand what impacts the landscape for business.
As a methodology.
And so we went back and forth. And if I were to do the research now, I might add the role of the consumer.
Okay.
That's as a 7th one. We didn't. So now looking back, if I were to say, did we have the right list of 6? Yes, but I would have probably added that one. And then we got a sense of the way in which people dealt with the context. They either created something new, they maximized something, or they turned something around. And that's where we developed this notion of contextual intelligence, that businesses and business leaders that were successful for long periods of time were able to have this, what we call periphery vision, understand what was going on in the context, and how was those factors impacting their business. So not all 6 factors impact an industry in the same level, but which ones are most important, and what does that mean for how I should lead? So that was the first aspect of contextual intelligence, is just being aware and understanding the context, understanding what's going on. The second is then having the personal characteristics to do one of these 3 things that I talked about, either to shape the context or be shaped by it by creating something new, optimizing a business model, or turning something around. And then the final aspect of contextual intelligence is really adaptability to change. So how do you change your style, your leadership approach, the strategy of your company as the context changes? If you keep operating in the same way and things change in the context, you're setting yourself up for disaster. So how do leaders navigate that context? And so that's what we looked at, and that came out of the research. We weren't exactly sure what was going to come out of the research, and that's where what we indicated as the key to success for many of these.
Was there any surprise during the research? I'll say, oh, I never imagined that, look at this.
The surprise to me was the contextual intelligence wasn't overly surprising. What was surprising is, when you think about great business leaders, you often think about these larger-than-life figures who, had this have
kind
this
of
charisma,
hero.
this hero
Yeah.
worship type of thing. And when you do the research and you dive deep into their history, these are all flawed individuals. They're not saints. You know, if we were to hold them up to a moral standard,
Yeah.
they may or may not measure that. And so one of the surprises for me was how average in many ways these leaders were, how they failed several times before they were successful. We often just talk about their success, but the trials and tribulations they had to get to where they are. And so when you take a step back, these are not necessarily people, and I would always debate with Nithin because he said, Tony, don't fall in love with these leaders. You know, they're flawed individuals. And so
Don't talk to them like this.
Yeah. And so for me, that was a surprise, is sort of the ordinariness of some of their lives and what they did. So it didn't seem so far out of reach.
Yeah. I think in other times it was much more easier to be aware of the context.
Yeah.
Today we have this huge flow of information,
Yes.
and if you really want to know or to be aware of all the things, you just got crazy.
Yes.
Do you think it's possible, as it were in other decades, to be a contextual, intelligent, aware person?
I think you can be, but I think you're right. I think the whole notion of social media and the proliferation of information, it's much harder to sift out what's important.
Yeah.
And so you have to be very diligent about understanding, okay, what is relevant to our particular business, and making those judgment calls when you're inundated with all of this data. I think in some ways it's easier to be contextual intelligence because you have access to this information.
Sure.
In other ways it's harder
But you have to
because
know how to
you have to
manage.
sift it, you have to manage it, exactly.
Yeah.
You have to be able to be disciplined about what's important and what's not.
Just a quick one, do you think it's big data is the answer for this? Or it's another monster they're creating?
Well, big data can be. I think nobody's been able to really crack the nut on that, you know. And so prior to my life in academia, I spent 10 years in the database marketing and advertising industry.
Yeah.
And a big focus of that was customer relationship management, that you have, you know, points of contact with your customer at different points, on the web, in social media, in store, in person. And nobody's been able to sort of aggregate that in a way that has been beneficial to the customer and to the end. It's still sort of the holy grail of sort of figuring out.
Standardize?
Well, saying, okay, this person bought this product. So what people mostly do, at least in the early days, they'd say, oh, this person bought this product, so they have a 60% likelihood that they'll buy that product. So I should market that to that person. Nowadays, people are saying, oh, they bought this product, but they bought it on the web, they bought this product in store. How do I think about the way in which I'm going to have a relationship with my customer that brings all that data together? There's one company, Burberry, that's actually doing a pretty good job of that. The CEO has made their investment in social media and contact with the customers a big focus for the work that they're doing. But that tends to be a difficult nut to crack for many companies.
Great. And can leaders learn from history with so many different contexts?
Yep. So you can learn.
Is it important?
I think understanding history in the past is important. You can learn what not to do, in addition to sort of what you need to do going forward. Certainly, the context changes, and so you don't want to be doing the same. The whole point of contextual intelligence is not to do the same thing over and over in a different context. But you can sort of learn from what mistakes people made, how they thought about the context, what things that they pay attention to, that sort of thing. And I think that's important. I think we lose sight of a lot of things are not new. It's how you interpret it, how you push it forward, what spin you put on it. And you can learn some of that from studying history.
And another thing you said on your lecture was about emotional intelligence.
Yep.
And in a way, emotional intelligence isn't quite the same or like the contextual, because you have to be aware of the environment, but more looking to the people, to the human figure.
Yeah. So I think they complement
There's
each
a
other.
relation.
There's a relationship. So one is a macro level view. So if I think about contextual intelligence, it's the broader view, the macro level view of the world. When I think of emotional intelligence, it's the smaller one-on-one relationship. And you have to have both. You have to understand how the world's operating to be able to manage your strategy, but then you need to execute that strategy. So you have to rely on your team, you have to rely on your organization to do that. You need emotional intelligence to inspire and motivate people to want to enact that strategy.
And what do you think is the key factor in emotional intelligence that can help leaders today succeed with people?
Well, the core of it is really self-awareness. So do you know your strengths and weaknesses? Do you know what you need to develop?
Before you know others?
Before you know others, you have to know yourself. Know thyself, they say.
Know thyself, yeah, sure.
So I think part of it is self-awareness. And are you creating a context in which you're allowing different points of view, different information to come your way? And are you open to that? Or do you create a closed context where people are just telling you what you want to hear? And do you know the difference?
Oh, yeah.
And that's a big part of it. So I think that's the cornerstone.
And do you have or do you find any interesting story that you can share with us that has in the book or during your research?
Well, there are two people. A lot of people ask me, who do I admire? So I looked at 1,000 leaders, and who are my 2 or 3 favorite people?
Okay.
And so they're sort of no-name people that you'll have never heard of. But the reason that I admire them. So one of them is William Fairbairn, which nobody would know about. But he was a shipbuilder actually for a number of years. He came from Scotland to Maine, and he was recruited by a management consulting firm and eventually ended up becoming the CEO of Diamond Match Company. This is the matches, so it's an old technology, but this was in the 1910s period. And a lot of what was happening in the industry is that matches were spontaneously combusting and creating fires in kitchens, and rats were actually gnawing at matches, and they were getting inflamed. And so there's all of this. So that was happening on the consumer side, and on the industrial side, the workers who were actually making the matches were suffering significant medical complications from the fumes of the phosphorus that's part of the match head. He discovered a technology to eliminate the dangers of spontaneous combustion and the dangers of the fumes, and he created this air conditioning ventilation system in his factory prior to the invention of air conditioning, actually.
Okay.
And so he did all of that, and the thing that impressed, so that's, a lot of leaders do that, but one of the things that impressed me most is he decided to give the technology away to the industry. And so many, his board and others were very concerned that, we were giving away our secrets. But he said, no, if this is going to save lives, I think we need to do it. And they had a 80-90% of the market share anyway. People said that was going to erode. It didn't. He gave the technology away for free. And then at the end, he still maintained the high market share. So it didn't really matter. It didn't have that negative effect, but it showed his willingness to sort of go above and beyond. And that's, so if I look at leaders, it's individuals who, yes, are technically adept and are thinking about the context, but also thinking about a broader picture. And so he is one who I would have never known about. I mean, he's not someone that we celebrate. And so I admired him.
Great. You're collecting data. Is there? We will have 2000, 2010, 2010, 2020, and so on.
So we're looking at the context today and trying to get a sense of, okay, what does it take to succeed in today's environment, and who are sort of some of the aspiring leaders. And so when I teach my MBA class on great business leaders, I often ask the students to, okay, who would you nominate in today's context as being a great business leader? And a lot of them talk about the founders of Google, or Mark Zuckerberg hasn't gotten very many votes yet, but that may or may not change. It depends on that. Or they'll talk about Meg Whitman when she was at eBay.
Steve Jobs is one of them?
Steve Jobs, yes, they admire him. I mean, they admired him in the past. So he's an interesting person because he reinvented himself. So in his early part of his career, he would be characterized in our book as an entrepreneur. He created something new in 1975 with Steve Wozniak and what they did with the Mac. That was one thing. And then his second chapter in his life, he was really a leader. He fundamentally helped, he left, was kicked out of Apple, came back. And so when he came back, he was really the archetype of the leader that we talk about, somebody who sees opportunity, somebody who manages a turnaround. One of the things that is interesting, and we'll never know because of his passing, is could he have gone to the management side to optimize it? And he was in that direction, but that was not his forte. But it probably would have gone that direction. In fact, I teach a case about Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, and their parallel lives in terms of what they.
In many ways.
In many ways. And the students often admire Steve Jobs more than Bill Gates, even though in their early career, Bill Gates was far more successful in terms of what he did for Microsoft. I mean, his legacy is now tainted a bit in terms of where Microsoft is, but where Apple's is just in the reverse. But if I had done this 10 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, it would have been a very different story. Sure. So I often have to fight to defend Bill Gates in my class, and which is surprising to me.
And you're director of the Leadership Initiative. What is this? What do you look for over there?
So part of the Leadership Initiative has two purposes. One is we oversee cross-disciplinary research, looking at, because leadership cuts across finance and marketing and human resources, and so we sponsor large-scale research projects that cut across multiple disciplines. Okay. The other thing is that we do is that we develop leadership development programs for high potential executives, and so we have a very large cadre of programs that we offer for managers at different levels in their career, junior leaders, mid-career managers, and then senior executives. And we design a combination of experiential-based leadership activities as well as case-based teaching methodologies to help them develop their leadership potential. So our goal is really to try to help companies and individuals unleash their leadership potential.
And what do you think about this new generation leadership? Are we going to have great leaders? Are we going to have what?
I think that's a tough one. I think that, yes.
Only time will tell.
I think time will tell. It's interesting because I think what we're seeing today is that there's a much broader focus on the younger generation wanting to change jobs, look for new opportunities, get more responsibility. They're also somewhat willing to take risks. So one of the things that we're seeing is the appetite for risks and to move forward is not as great now as it was in the past, and that's partly given what we've gone through in terms of society and the global recession. So time will tell to see how that plays out in terms of the future.
Great, Professor.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It's a really pleasure. It was really a pleasure talking to you here in our TV, Harvard Brasil.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. E você, gostou da nossa conversa? Existem muitos outros vídeos como esse que você pode assistir aqui na TV Harvard. Compartilhe conhecimento.